It was supposed to be just another ordinary day for her. The sun was bright, and the city was alive with the usual noise of footsteps, honking cars, and voices blending together in the busy street. She had taken her usual route to a small café near her office, planning to grab a coffee before starting her long shift. She carried herself with quiet grace, not bothering anyone, not asking for attention. She was used to blending into the crowd, moving forward with her head high, even when life was not always fair to her. Inside the café, the air smelled of roasted beans and fresh bread. People stood in line, some talking in low voices, others glued to their phones. She took her place at the end of the line, her mind already drifting toward the tasks she had to complete that day. But she did not know that her simple morning routine would soon turn into something unforgettable. Near the counter stood a tall, white man. His clothes were sharp, his voice loud, and his eyes restless. He was the kind of man who looked for someone to step on, someone weaker, someone who could not or would not fight back. He was known in that neighborhood as arrogant and quick to insult. He was already irritated because the barista had gotten his order wrong, and his anger needed a new target. When his eyes fell on her, something cruel sparked inside him. He muttered something under his breath, then raised his voice. "Figures," he said, loud enough for others to hear. "Always cutting in, always acting like you belong." She froze for a moment, her lips pressing together. She had not cut in line. She had simply walked in and stood quietly. But the way he said it, with that sharp, ugly tone, made her chest tighten. She decided to ignore him. She kept her eyes forward, reminding herself she had done nothing wrong. Silence, she thought, was the best weapon, but silence only encouraged him. He took a step closer, his voice growing bolder. "Look at you, thinking you're something special," he sneered. "People like you should know your place." His words dripped with poison, and some people in the café shifted uncomfortably. A few turned their eyes away, pretending not to notice. Nobody wanted trouble. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of anger she had carried for years. This was not the first time she had faced such ugliness. She had dealt with whispered comments on the bus, rude stares in the office, and neighbors who pretended she did not exist. But this man's words were different. They cut deeper because he wanted to humiliate her in front of everyone. She clenched her jaw and kept her calm. "I'm not here to argue with you," she said softly, her voice steady. She thought that would end it, that he would back down if she refused to play his game. Instead, his smirk widened. He leaned closer, so close she could smell the bitterness of coffee on his breath. "Don't talk back to me," he hissed. "You don't belong here." The café grew quiet. The barista stopped mid-pour. Two women in the corner whispered nervously. A young man near the door lifted his phone, recording just in case something happened. Everyone felt the tension, the storm building between the two. She stepped back slightly, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She wanted to walk away, but something inside her told her not to. She had walked away too many times before. Too many times she had swallowed her pride just to avoid conflict. The man's face twisted with rage when she did not move. In a sudden flash of violence, he shoved her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. "I said know your place," he shouted, and before anyone could stop him, his hand lashed out, striking her across the cheek. The sound cracked through the café like thunder. Gasps filled the air. A woman screamed. The barista dropped a cup, shattering it on the floor. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. She stood frozen, her cheeks stinging, her vision swimming. She could not believe what had just happened, not because she had never seen hate before, but because he had dared to cross that final line in public, in front of witnesses. He thought he could hit her and walk away, just like that. The man straightened his shoulders, satisfied with himself. He looked around at the crowd, as if daring them to say something. But no one moved. No one spoke. The café was silent except for the quick, shallow breaths of those watching. She felt her anger rise, stronger than the sting of his hand. Her eyes burned not with tears but with fire. She realized in that moment that she was standing at a crossroad. Either she would stay silent, like so many times before, or she would show him and everyone else that she was not weak, her fingers curled into a fist. Her heart beat faster, her breath steadier. The fear that had once silenced her began to fade, replaced by a strength she had almost forgotten she had. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a powerful man, but a coward hiding behind cruelty. The café waited. Every eye was on her, and though the moment felt endless, she knew one thing with certainty. She would not walk away this time. The café was silent. The sound of his hand still seemed to echo in the air, hanging heavy like smoke after a fire. Her cheek burned, but it was not just the pain that filled her. It was something stronger, something rising deep inside her chest. She had been hit before in life, not always by hands, but by words, by prejudice, by the quiet cruelty of people who thought they were better. But this time was different. This time there were eyes on her, cameras recording, and something inside her whispered that this was the moment she could not let slip away. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The man smirked, thinking it was over, that he had won. He crossed his arms and looked around proudly, daring anyone to speak. "That's what happens when people don't learn their place," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Some people lowered their heads. Others turned away. A young boy clutched his mother's arm, whispering, "Why did he hit her?" The mother shushed him, too afraid to answer. No one moved. No one dared, but she did. Slowly, she straightened her back. The sting in her cheek faded beneath the weight of her resolve. Her eyes, dark and sharp, locked on him. For a long moment they stood there, him grinning with arrogance, her silent but unbroken. Then, with a sudden movement that shocked everyone, she raised her hand and struck him back. The sound of her palm connecting with his face was sharp and clear. The café gasped again, but this time the silence that followed felt different. It was not frozen in fear. It was charged with electricity, with disbelief, with admiration. The man staggered backward, his smirk wiped clean, replaced by shock. His eyes widened, and for the first time that morning he looked uncertain. You hit me?" He stuttered, as if he could not believe it. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice strong enough to fill the café. "And that's the last time you ever put your hands on me." The crowd shifted, people leaning forward, eyes wide. They could not look away. Her voice carried weight, not just because of the slap, but because it came from years of silence finally broken. The man's face twisted with rage again. He lunged toward her, but before he could take another step, two men from the back of the café moved forward. "That's enough," one said, grabbing his arm. The other stood between them, blocking his path. For the first time, people were standing up, not just watching. Phones were raised higher now, recording every angle. The man shouted, "She attacked me first. She hit me out of nowhere." But his words sounded weak against the clear memory of what everyone had just seen. The woman didn't back down. "You hit me," she said, her voice calm but loud enough for all to hear. "In front of everyone here. You thought no one would stop you. You thought I would just take it. But I won't." Her words were like a spark. A woman near the counter called out, "That's right." Another man muttered, "About time someone stood up to him." Murmurs spread through the café, voices no longer silent, no longer afraid. The man, red-faced and furious, struggled against the two who held him back. "This isn't over." He spat, but the strength in his voice was gone. He no longer looked like a powerful bully. He looked like a cornered animal. She stood tall, breathing hard but steady. Her cheeks still hurt, but her spirit felt unshaken, almost stronger. She realized she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told to be quiet, to accept mistreatment, to bow their head and walk away. The café door opened, and a man in uniform stepped inside, an officer called by someone moments earlier. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the tension, the raised phones, the way the white man was being restrained. "What's going on here?" the officer asked. Everyone spoke at once, voices rising like a tide. "He hit her first!" someone shouted. "It's all on camera," another said, waving their phone. The officer raised a hand. "One at a time. Let me hear from her." She nodded, her voice steady. "He attacked me. He hit me across the face for no reason, in front of everyone. I defended myself. The officer's gaze turned to the man, whose face was still red from both the slap and his own fury. "Is that true?" "She's lying," he shouted. "She came at me. She's trying to make me look bad." But as he spoke, half a dozen phones were lifted higher, screens glowing. Each one showed the truth. The officer sighed, looking tired. "We'll sort this out at the station." He gestured toward the man. "You're coming with me?" The man sputtered, trying to resist, but the crowd pressed closer, making it clear there was no escape. The officer took him firmly by the arm, leading him toward the door. As he was dragged out, the café erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. People clapped, some cheered, others simply smiled with relief. For the first time that morning, the woman felt the weight on her chest lift. She had fought back. She had not stayed silent, and in doing so, she had changed more than just her own story. She had changed the room, maybe even more. The police car's flashing lights painted the street outside the café in red and blue. People stood by the windows, still buzzing with excitement, as the officer led the white man out in handcuffs. His face twisted with anger, his voice raised in protest. "This is a mistake. You'll regret this." "She's lying." But no one believed him anymore. The crowd had seen the truth with their own eyes, and their cameras had captured every second. The woman stepped outside slowly, her legs trembling from the adrenaline. She still felt the sting on her cheek, but it no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had stood her ground. The officer approached her, his tone calmer than before. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come down to the station to give your statement." She nodded. She was nervous, but she wasn't afraid anymore. The cafe patrons clapped softly as she walked past, some whispering words of encouragement. A woman placed a hand on her arm and said, "You were brave. You spoke for all of us." Her chest swelled with emotion. She had never felt like a hero before. She had simply acted because she had no choice. At the station, the air was cooler, quieter. The officer guided her to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. "Please sit," he said, offering her a glass of water. She thanked him and sat down, her hands wrapped tightly around the cup. Minutes later, another officer entered holding a clipboard. "We'll need to hear your account," he said gently. "Start from the beginning. Tell us everything." She took a deep breath. The memories of the morning rushed back. She explained how she had walked into the café, how the man had insulted her, how she had tried to ignore him. Her voice shook slightly when she described the moment he hit her, but she stayed steady. "He thought I would just stand there like I didn't matter," she said, her eyes fixed on the officer. "But I couldn't let him do that to me. Not again. Not ever." The officer nodded, writing carefully. "And you defended yourself after he struck you?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I stood up for myself." The officer leaned back, looking at her with respect. "There are multiple witness statements and videos. Your story matches everything we've gathered so far. You don't need to worry." Relief washed over her, but it was mixed with something else, pride. She realized that for the first time in her life, her voice was being heard, her truth was being recognized. Meanwhile, in another room, the man sat red-faced, his arms crossed tightly. He barked at the officer who questioned him. "She provoked me. She was rude, arrogant. I had to put her in her place." His words were bitter, his tone defensive. But when the officer played back a recording from a witness's phone, the man's face went pale. There he was on screen, shouting, shoving, and striking her. His lies collapsed in seconds. Back in her room, she waited quietly. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends who had already seen the video online. "Are you okay? We're so proud of you. You're trending right now." She didn't know what trending really meant, but she felt the weight of those words. Her story was spreading beyond the walls of the cafe, beyond the city. An officer returned, his expression more relaxed now. "You can go home for today. We'll keep you updated." He's facing charges, assault and possibly hate crime charges, depending on the review. Her eyes widened slightly. Hate crime. Those words felt heavy, but they were right. That was what it was. Not just violence, but violence rooted in hate. As she stepped out of the station, the evening air hit her face, cool and fresh. Reporters were already gathering outside, cameras flashing, voices calling out. "Can you tell us what happened?" How did it feel to stand up to him? Do you see yourself as a hero? She froze for a moment, overwhelmed. She had not asked for this attention. She was just a woman who wanted her morning coffee. But now she was the center of something much bigger. She spoke softly but clearly. I'm not a hero. I'm just tired of being silent. He thought he could hit me because of who I am. But I wanted him and everyone to know that I won't stay quiet anymore. None of us should. Her words rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled notes. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn blared, and the world carried on. But for her, everything had changed. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the videos now flooding social media. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Some called her brave, others thanked her for inspiring them. She read messages from strangers saying, "You gave me courage, and because of you, I'll speak up too." Tears finally came, not from pain, but from release. She had carried so much weight, so many silent battles, and now she had let them go. She was no longer just another face in the crowd. She was proof that standing up even once could change everything. The next morning, the city felt different. The video from the café had already spread everywhere overnight. On buses, in offices, and on street corners, people were talking about it. Strangers watched the clip on their phones, shaking their heads in disbelief, or clapping at the moment she stood tall and fought back. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become a spark that lit fires of conversation across the country. She woke up to dozens of messages and missed calls. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, co-workers, even people she had not spoken to in years reached out. "You were amazing. We're proud of you. You gave me courage." At first, she didn't know how to respond. She had never been in the center of attention before. She had always lived quietly, doing her job, minding her own business. But now the whole world seemed to know her name. At the local café where it all began, people gathered again, not for coffee this time, but to talk. They remembered how frozen they had felt in that moment, how afraid they had been to act. One man admitted, "When he hit her, I should have stepped in right away. But I just froze. She was braver than all of us." Others nodded, ashamed but also inspired. They promised themselves that next time they wouldn't stay silent. Meanwhile, the white man sat in a holding cell, his arrogance melting away. He paced back and forth, cursing under his breath. He had once felt untouchable, like no one could ever challenge him. But now his name was trending too, only in the worst way possible. Employers who once admired his confidence began cutting ties. Old friends avoided him. His face was plastered across news channels as the racist man from the café. For the first time, he felt the sting of the same shame he had tried to force on others. Back at her apartment, the woman sat quietly by the window, sipping tea. She felt the weight of everything pressing on her shoulders. She hadn't asked for this fame, and yet it had come to her. What would she do with it? Should she speak out more? Or should she disappear back into the shadows and let the world move on? That afternoon, she received a call from a community leader. "We've seen what you did," the woman on the phone said warmly. "Would you be willing to speak at a small gathering? People need to hear your voice. They need to know they're not alone." She hesitated. Public speaking was not her strength. But then she remembered the look on the faces in the café, the silence, the fear, and then the relief when she fought back. She realized her story could give others courage. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll do it." When she arrived at the community hall, she was surprised to see how many people were already waiting. Dozens of faces, some young, some old, looked at her with hope in their eyes. The room buzzed with quiet conversation until she stepped onto the small stage. For a moment she froze. She had never stood in front of a crowd before. Her palms were sweaty, her heart raced. But then she looked at them and remembered the pain of that slap, the weight of years of silence, and the strength she had found in one single moment of defiance. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I never wanted to be in this position," she said softly, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I only wanted to drink my coffee and go to work. But when he hit me, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about every time someone thought they could hurt us, silence us, make us small. And I knew if I stayed quiet again, it would never stop. The room grew silent, her words sinking into every heart. Some people nodded, others wiped their eyes. She continued, her voice growing stronger. We don't always get to choose the fights that come to us, but we can choose how we respond. That day, I chose to fight back, and I hope that next time, if it happens to any of you, you'll choose the same. When she finished, the crowd erupted into applause. People stood clapping, cheering, some even shouting her name. She felt a wave of warmth rush over her. She wasn't just one woman anymore, she was a symbol, a reminder that courage could rise even in the most ordinary moments. That night, more videos spread online. Not just the original café video, but now clips of her speech, her words shared with captions like, "She stood up for herself, and now she's standing up for all of us." The internet responded with fire. Hashtags rose again, louder than before. Celebrities tweeted their support. News anchors replayed her speech, praising her bravery. What had started as a painful moment of violence had turned into a movement. Painful moment of violence had turned into a movement. And in her quiet apartment, she sat by the window once more, looking out at the glowing city lights. She still felt nervous about what the future would bring, but for the first time, she also felt ready. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches, cameras clicked outside the doors, and curious citizens lined up early just to witness the trial. It was no longer just about one woman and one man. It had become a case everyone was watching, one that would decide whether hate and violence could hide behind arrogance, or whether truth would finally have its say. She walked into the courtroom slowly, her chin raised. The sting of that day in the café had long faded from her cheek, but the memory was still alive inside her. She wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, but she carried herself with quiet strength. People in the audience whispered as she passed, some nodding in respect. Across the room, the man sat with his lawyer, his face pale but still hardened with pride. He avoided her gaze, pretending to be unfazed, but his fingers drummed nervously on the table. He had spent weeks locked in his own bitterness, shouting to anyone who would listen that he was the victim. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. The trial began. Witnesses from the café were called one by one. A young man described how the argument started. She was quiet. She didn't say anything until he pushed her. Then he hit her hard. His voice shook as he spoke, guilt heavy in his tone. "I should have stepped in sooner." Another witness, the barista, held up her phone. "I recorded everything. You can see it yourself." The screen was played in front of the court, the sound echoing. The man's hateful words filled the chamber, followed by the sharp crack of his hand across her face. Gasps rippled through the room, and then came the moment everyone loved. The moment she struck back, her voice declaring, "That's the last time you ever put your hands on me." The judge leaned forward, his expression grave. The video was undeniable. Then it was her turn to take the stand. She walked slowly, her hands steady, her heart pounding. Sitting down, she looked straight at the jury. "Tell us in your own words what happened that day," the lawyer asked. She nodded and began. "I walked into the cafe like I always do. I was just trying to get my morning coffee. I didn't look for trouble. I didn't say anything to him, but he chose me. He insulted me because of my skin. He wanted to make me feel small." Her voice softened for a moment, then grew stronger. "Man, when I didn't react, he hit me." The courtroom was silent. Every word carried weight. She paused, then continued. "All my life I've been told to stay quiet, to walk away, to avoid making things worse. But in that moment, I realized silence only gives bullies more power. So I stood up. I fought back, not just for me, but for everyone who has been told to be quiet." A murmur of agreement passed through the courtroom. Some jurors even looked moved, their eyes softer as they listened. The defense lawyer tried to push back. "Isn't it true that you struck my client?" "Yes," she replied firmly. "I struck him after he assaulted me. I defended myself, and I'd do it again if I had to." Her words rang out like a hammer against stone, strong, unshaken. The man finally spoke, standing with anger boiling in his face. "She's lying. She provoked me. She wanted this. His voice cracked as he shouted, his fists clenched tight. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order. But the outburst had already betrayed him. The jury had seen his true colors, the same cruelty from the café rising again. The trial lasted for hours, but the outcome became clearer with every passing moment. Witnesses, videos, her testimony, all pointed to the same truth. He was guilty. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom held its breath. The foreman stood and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of assault and guilty of committing a hate crime." Gasps and whispers filled the room. The man's face fell, his pride shattering as the words hit him. He tried to protest, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm, shaking his head. It was over. The judge turned to the woman. "You showed remarkable courage, both during the incident and here in court. This case will be remembered." Then he turned to the man. "You will serve your sentence. Justice has been done." Applause broke out from the back of the courtroom. People stood clapping, some even cheering. She sat quietly, tears forming in her eyes, not from sadness but from release. The fight was over. She had won, not just against him, but against the silence that had chained her for years. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed toward her. Microphones and cameras surrounded her, voices overlapping with questions. But she spoke clearly, her voice calm and strong. "This wasn't just about me. It was about showing that no one has the right to treat us as less, no matter what color our skin is." Today, justice was served. But tomorrow, the real work continues. For all of us, her words spread across news channels and social media within minutes. People cheered her bravery, calling her an icon of resistance and hope. Across the world, strangers felt empowered by her stand. And that night, as she sat alone in her apartment once again, she looked at her reflection in the window. The city lights glowed behind her, but this time, she didn't see just herself. She saw strength, resilience, and the beginning of something bigger. She had turned pain into power, and the world had listened. The weeks after the trial felt like a whirlwind. Life, which once had been quiet and ordinary, was no longer the same for her. Everywhere she went, people recognized her face. Some would stop her on the street, shaking her hand and saying, "Thank you for standing up." Others smiled silently, their eyes filled with respect. It was strange, even overwhelming, but also deeply moving. At her workplace, colleagues who once barely noticed her now greeted her warmly. A manager who had never spoken more than a few words told her, "You showed all of us what courage looks like." She smiled politely, but inside she thought about all the times she had felt invisible before. Why did it take one slap, one act of violence, for people to finally see her? The media continued to chase her. Reporters called every day, asking for interviews. Some wanted her to share her story again. Others wanted her opinion on bigger issues, racism, equality, justice. She tried to answer when she could, but she also guarded her peace. She reminded herself that she was not just a headline. She was a human being who needed rest, who still had quiet mornings when she just wanted to sip tea and watch the sunrise. One evening, she received an invitation to speak at a televised town hall about racism in the community. She hesitated at first. She was not a politician, not a speaker by profession. She was just a woman who wanted coffee one morning and ended up fighting for her dignity. But then she remembered the community hall gathering, the faces of people who had drawn courage from her. She thought of the young boy in the café who had asked his mother why the man hit her. What lesson would he carry into his future? With that thought, she said yes. The night of the town hall, the lights were bright and the cameras lined the room. She felt nervous as she stepped onto the stage, but when she saw the audience, people from all walks of life waiting to hear her, she found her voice. "I never planned for any of this," she began. "I didn't ask for attention. I only defended myself when I was attacked. But I realized something that day. The silence of others is what gives hate its power. When people stay quiet, bullies grow stronger. When people turn away, injustice keeps winning. That day in the cafe, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. And neither should you." The room erupted in applause. Some people rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. The cameras caught every second, and soon her words traveled across the internet once again. People shared clips of her speech saying, "She speaks for all of us," but fame also brought challenges. Not everyone supported her. Online, hateful comments appeared alongside the praise. Some tried to twist her story, calling her aggressive or lucky the man didn't press harder. She read some of these comments late at night, and for a moment, doubt crept into her heart. Had she done the right thing? Was she strong enough to keep carrying this weight? The next morning, as she walked through the park, an elderly woman approached her. She was frail, walking with a cane, but her eyes were sharp. "You don't know me," the woman said, her voice trembling. "But I lived through times when women like us couldn't even walk into certain places. We were told to bow our heads, to keep silent. But you lifted your head high. You reminded me of the fight I thought was long gone." Tears filled her eyes as she hugged the woman gently. In that moment, the hateful voices online felt small, powerless. The real voices, the ones that mattered, were the ones filled with gratitude and hope. In the following weeks, she began to speak at schools, community centers, and gatherings. She told her story not to relive the pain, but to show others that they too could fight back against hate. At each place, she met young people who said, "You gave me courage," and parents who said, "I want my children to grow up knowing they don't have to stay silent." The white man, meanwhile, remained in prison. News outlets reported on his downfall, how he had lost his job, how his former friends abandoned him, how even his family turned away. His name, once spoken with arrogance, now carried shame. He was a reminder of what hate leads to: isolation, downfall, and emptiness. For her, life was still not easy. Some days she woke up tired, overwhelmed by the weight of so many eyes on her. But when she remembered why she fought back, she found her strength again. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was carrying the voices of many. One night, as she walked home under the quiet glow of streetlights, she thought back to the moment in the café when everything had changed. The sting of that slap, the silence of the crowd, the way her heart had screamed for her to do something. She realized that moment had not broken her, it had built her. It had transformed her into someone stronger, someone unshakable. And as she looked up at the sky, stars scattered like tiny lights of hope, she whispered softly to herself, "This is only the beginning." The weeks turned into months, and what began as one woman's fight in a café grew into something far greater. Across the city, rallies and marches began to form. People carried signs with words of justice, equality, and courage. Some even carried posters with her face on them, not because she asked for it, but because her story had touched their hearts. She watched these rallies on the news, sometimes in disbelief. She had never imagined herself as a symbol. She had never wanted fame. But now, people shouted her name in the streets as if she was a leader. "Stand tall like her," they cried. "Never be silent again." At first, she felt nervous about the movement. She was just a woman who wanted to drink coffee in peace. She never studied politics, never trained to be a leader. But she realized something important. Real leaders are not chosen by themselves. They are chosen by the people. And now the people had chosen her. She began attending some of the marches. The first time she stepped into the crowd, thousands of people erupted into cheers. She walked with them side by side, holding hands with strangers who now felt like family. People of all races, ages, and backgrounds marched together, their voices rising as one. At one rally, she took the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces, candles glowing in their hands. "This movement is not about me," she said firmly. "It is about all of us. It is about making sure no one is ever silenced again. It is about showing the world that hate will never win." The crowd roared with approval. People wept, clapped, and hugged each other. Some shouted, "We're with you." Others simply whispered prayers of thanks. For the first time in her life, she felt something larger than herself. She felt the strength of a united community. But the movement also drew opposition. Groups who wanted to protect the old ways began to protest against her. They held their own rallies, shouting insults, spreading lies online, and painting her as a troublemaker. She saw her face twisted in hateful posters, her name dragged through mud by people who had never even met her. At first, the attacks hurt. She sat awake at night, reading the lies, her heart heavy with doubt. Was she causing more division? Was she making life harder for herself and others? But then, she remembered the faces in the crowd, the children who told her she gave them courage, the old woman who had thanked her for lifting her head high. Those voices mattered more than the hate. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a university. The hall was full of students, their eyes wide with admiration. After her speech, a young girl approached her. She was shy, her voice barely above a whisper. "They laugh at me at school because of my skin," the girl said. "Sometimes I cry at night. But when I saw your video, I told myself I would never cry again. I want to be like you." Tears filled her eyes as she hugged the girl tightly. In that moment, she knew she could not stop. She had to keep going, not for herself, but for those who needed hope. The white man, now serving his sentence, saw the news from his prison cell. He watched the rallies, the speeches, the love she received. His face twisted with regret, though he would never admit it out loud. He had tried to humiliate her, but instead, he had made her stronger than ever. He had thought one slap would silence her, but it had only given her a voice that echoed across the nation. Meanwhile, leaders in government began to take notice. Her story was mentioned in debates, her name cited in discussions about new laws against hate crimes. She was invited to meet with officials, to share her thoughts on how to protect people from prejudice and violence. She never imagined sitting at such tables, speaking to such powerful people. Yet she did, her voice calm, steady, and full of truth. Her life was no longer simple. Each day brought interviews, speeches, and meetings. But she carried it all with dignity. She made time for herself too, walking alone in the park, sitting with her tea by the window, reminding herself that she was still the same woman who once just wanted peace. And still, every night when she lay down to rest, she thought of that café, the sound of the slap, the silence of the crowd, the way her heart had screamed that day. That moment had changed everything. It had been the spark for a fire that now burned brightly across the country. As the movement grew, people began saying her name alongside words like strength, resistance, and hope. She never asked for such titles, but she carried them because she knew they did not belong only to her. They belonged to everyone who marched, everyone who stood, everyone who spoke up. And as she stood at yet another rally one evening, candles lighting the faces around her, she looked out at the crowd and thought to herself, "This is bigger than me now. This is a fight for generations to come." Months later, the world still remembered her story. What began in a small cafe had now reached across cities, countries, and even oceans. News stations in faraway lands spoke her name. Social media continued to share her speech, her courage, her moment of defiance. But for her, the journey had never been about fame. It was about dignity, justice, and hope. She stood on a stage one evening at the largest gathering yet. Tens of thousands of people filled the square, their voices rising like a wave. Candles and banners lit the night, glowing like stars across the crowd. The sound of drums, chants, and singing filled the air. It was not a protest anymore. It was a movement, a celebration of unity. She walked slowly to the microphone. The crowd grew silent, waiting. Her heart beat heavy in her chest, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. She looked at the faces before her, young and old, black and white, men and women, all standing together. It brought tears to her eyes. "When that man hit me," she began, her voice steady, "I thought I was alone. I thought I would stand there, humiliated, and walk away in silence like I had so many times before. But when I fought back, I learned something powerful. I was never alone. And neither are you." The crowd erupted in cheers, but she raised her hand and the square fell quiet again. We live in a world where hate still tries to divide us, where some believe they can hurt others without consequence. But look around you. Look at what we've built together. Hate wanted to silence us, but instead it gave us a voice louder than ever before. Hate wanted to break us, but instead it made us unbreakable. Applause thundered through the square. People wiped their eyes, hugging each other, holding their candles high. Her words poured into their hearts like fire and light. That night was not just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been pushed aside, insulted, or attacked. She had become a symbol, but the real victory was that the people had become brave too. They had learned from her to stand tall, to defend themselves, to speak the truth even when the world told them to stay quiet. In the weeks that followed, changes began to take shape. New laws were passed to strengthen protection against hate crimes. Community centers grew in number, offering safety and education. Schools began teaching children about courage, kindness, and equality. Her story was taught as an example, not of violence, but of resilience. One afternoon, she visited a classroom full of children. They sat in neat rows, their eyes wide with admiration. A little boy raised his hand and asked, "Were you scared that day?" She smiled gently. "Yes," she admitted. "I was scared, but being brave doesn't mean you aren't scared. It means you don't let fear decide for you." The boy nodded seriously, as if he had just learned the most important lesson of his life. The teacher looked on proudly, knowing those words would stay with the children forever. Meanwhile, the man who had struck her remained in prison, forgotten by most. He sat alone in his cell, watching the world move on without him. His name had become a warning, a reminder of what happens when cruelty meets courage. For her, life slowly found balance again. She still spoke at rallies and events, but she also returned to quiet mornings by her window, sipping tea as the sun rose. She walked in the park, smiled at strangers, and enjoyed moments of peace. She had learned that even warriors need rest, but even in those quiet moments, she carried the movement in her heart. She knew the fight against hate would never truly end. It would continue for generations. And she knew that her story was only one chapter in a much larger book, written by countless voices rising together. One evening, as she stood at the edge of a rally, watching the crowd chant for justice, she whispered softly to herself, "This was never about me alone. This was about all of us." The crowd raised their voices louder, their chants echoing into the night. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was no longer the sound. It was no longer the sound,